Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us this evening for a conversation with Habiba Ibrahim on her book, Black Age, Oceanic Lifespans in the Time of Black Life. My name is Caitlin, and I'm with the Seminary Co-op Bookstores in Chicago. Our stores were founded in 1961, and in 2019, they became the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. That mission recognizes bookstores as fundamental civic institutions and allows us to partner with like-minded partners on events like this one. Tonight, we're delighted to be partnering with the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. CSRPC is committed to establishing a new type of research institute devoted to the study of race and ethnicity, one that seeks to expand the study of race beyond the Black and white paradigm while exploring social and identity cleavages within racialized communities. I'll now introduce our presenters. Habiba Ibrahim is an associate professor of English at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is the author of Troubling the Family, The Promise of Personhood and the Rise of Multiracialism, and Black Age, which we're here to discuss this evening. She's the co-editor of the South Atlantic Quarterly Special Issue, Black Temporality in Time of Crisis, and among other venues, her work appears in African American Review and American Literary History. Habiba is joined in conversation by Kaneesha Parsard. Kaneesha writes about the legacies of slavery and emancipation in the Caribbean and broader Americas, with an emphasis on how gender and sexuality structure race, labor, and capital. Kaneesha is currently working on their first book project, An Illicit Wage. She is an assistant professor of English at the University of Chicago. We're so happy to have you both with us this evening, and I'll share one final note about format. There will be time for audience Q&A at the end of our program. Please make use of the chat function, which you'll find at the lower part of your screen, to submit any questions. And with that, I turn things over to Habiba and Kaneesha.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you so much for joining us, Habiba. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you about your fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Kaneesha. It's a privilege to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just get us started with our first question. So, Black age is all around us, as you've shown in adages like Black don't crack, and yet Black age is also understudied. So my first question is, how did you begin to study and write about Black age and lifespans?
That's a great question. Thank you. It is one of those difficult things because age is everywhere, and thus it's very difficult to sort of see it as a problem worthy of analysis, right? Because we're constantly, kind of implicated by what we understand it to be. And so I thought about it in terms of how age was connected to a particular moment in which we were living through, which was the 2010s, and the way that age was related to how time itself was beginning to feel conspicuous as a kind of a problem, right? As something that was open for our understanding as a moment of emergence. And so we understood this perhaps through the social justice movements that were rising in the 2010s. I understood it specifically through the murder of Trayvon Martin and the conversations around his boyhood and the way in which his boyhood was illegible. The way that Black childhood generally was illegible became a salient line of conversation. And so because there was so much conversation around the illegibility of Black childhood in particular, it really drew my mind toward the question of when Black age at any life stage is legible. We know that there's a long cultural history of Black age being a site of contestation and abuse insofar as its understandings are rife with conditions of domination. So when we think about Black adulthood, for instance, we often think about the way that Black adults have been infantilized. And so the conditions of the particular moment brought me to this question of how Black age in the present became a kind of question, a social category that was worthy of analysis. And in order to do that kind of analysis, I went to the sites of culture where age appears. And age perhaps doesn't necessarily appear as unusual, but it's culture generally where I see the emergence of particular meanings that perhaps escape the brush of conventional or dominant discourse. And so I went to the site of culture, specifically literary culture, but this would be, true for film, music, other cultural forms. Culture generally is where we might track how modes of contestation occur. So what I mean specifically is that age is associated with the abuses that we, kind of associate with racialized domination, but it's also associated with approaches to reclamation and approaches to thinking about alternative ways of living. And so I wanted to think of that tension as I was able to track it through the literary imagination and the Black literary imagination specifically.
That's so fascinating. I realized that reading your book, it's allowed me to think about how a moment becomes historical to begin with. We think often in our field about events and non-events, and increasingly, I think the present has, or the recent present, to think of the 2010s along with the 2020s, has begun to feel like a history in the present. There's a sense of significance and weight that comes along with it. And your book has really given me a vocabulary to think about that. I want to pick up on the point you made about method. So I have a methodological question. At the beginning of your book, you write, through the aesthetic and the literary, it's possible to imagine the time of another humanity beyond the time of man. And I would just love to hear more about how you stage history against literary inquiry, and particularly how you might stage literary inquiry against the time of man.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that question because it draws our attention toward a method that's not necessarily empirical in a historicist sense or in a conventional historicist sense. So this is to say that, I'm not a historian in a conventional sense. So my methods aren't necessarily empirical in the ways that historiographical methods would be. But I do think about history insofar as we can track the development of it through the ideologies and the modes of reasoning and the discourses that appear by virtue of institutional logics, by virtue of the way that they appear in culture, for instance. And so I wanted to think of not just the dominant ways in which we are given a way to, the dominant logics that we have for thinking about social life, right, which are fairly easy to account for. I wanted to think about what else emerges that's, outside of these dominant ideologies and ways of knowing. And so in a sense, it kind of reminds me of what Achille Mbembe says in terms of the unreason of reason when we think about Western modernity or, European modernity, that there's, on the one hand, a way of thinking about historical development as the sort of progressive movement of reason, and that would be the kind of dominant or, sort of hegemonic way of thinking about historical time. The other way of thinking about historical time is to think about the history of reason's unreason, which is what Mbembe tracks, right? And so in that sense, I was thinking about, Western modernity as giving us a kind of epistemic framework for thinking about what constitutes humanity, but there's the underbelly of that. People were unmade in terms of humanity, right? People were excluded from humanity. People were dispossessed of humanity. And I wanted to, in some ways, account for the underbelly of Western modernity. And that's kind of how I see age working as an analytical frame. On the one hand, it gives us an account of the dominant discourses and modes of reason through which we receive the meanings of social age. On the other hand, it becomes a route to thinking of what has been disavowed and what becomes legible if we're thinking about modernity's underbelly, the violence of that.
Yeah, it occurs to me that, it's a kind of time otherwise, that what you're calling us to do is to think about how we might inhabit what you call untimeliness, rather than assimilating to a kind of typical historical sense of time or a dominant sense of time. And in that way, I think I also want to go back to what you've said earlier about the 2010s and the conjuncture that animated this work, because in addition to thinking across media, Black Age is also really distinctly a Black feminist project. And so as you think about the untimeliness of Black Age, you're also showing us how Black gender is out of joint with what you call it, I'm quoting from you here, the proper subject, white, propertied, male, adult. And so I would love to hear more about how you understand Black childhood, Black boyhood and girlhood in Black Age. And I was particularly struck by your treatment of the lives of Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, and Devontae Hart.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to think about adulthood in this work as something other than the dominant way in which we think about the inevitability of adulthood as the, kind of taken for granted achievement of maturity. I want to think about it as a social status that is inextricable from the logic of being a particular kind of human subject, right? To be a particular subject within the logic of liberal humanism means that adulthood is meaningful through the conditions of race and gender and class. And this is to say that historically, the white property male can achieve the status of adulthood, whereas others are kind of excluded from this particular apex of human achievement. And so I was understanding the way of thinking about that through the discourses of Black feminism of the 1970s, where there are a number of accounts and narratives that begin with the experience of Black girlhood or begin with the experience of childhood. So I think about the Combahee River Collective statement and the way that that document accounts for the experience of being a Black girl, knowing that you are in some ways the antithesis of what is expected in terms of being a proper subject in the social world. And thus you have to make a set of decisions about what your trajectory is going to be, politically, socially, culturally. And it becomes the beginning of a politics. It becomes a way of thinking about another way to be, if we refer to Toni Morrison's Sula, right? A novel also produced during the early 1970s that thinks of the friendship of two girls who are in some ways inventing a way of being in the world, a world that doesn't think of their existence as worthwhile. And so I kind of think of childhood through the Black feminist lens of the 1970s and onward. I mean, the moment that we're in currently is, I think, a really important and interesting one insofar as we're seeing this just explosion of work in Black girlhood studies. And so, one can expand this project to sort of, kind of explore what that work is giving us in terms of a Black feminist analytic. But insofar as I was interested in thinking about Black feminism of the second wave in particular, or the 1970s into the 1980s, kind of giving us a kind of analytical frame for thinking about what might exist outside of the life we were told is the only life worth living. And what kind of politics do you build out of that? What kind of potential exists within that mode of existence? And so I see, the lives of children as being important in terms of fashioning a politics, right? So the lives of children aren't apolitical. In fact, those experiences become the beginning or the seedbed of a non-hierarchical, non-patriarchal mode of connectivity and relationality. And so with regard to Emmett Till, which I begin the book with, I think of Mamie Till Mobley as, of course, the mother of Emmett Till, who displays her son after his lynching, his faceless, fleshy face in the coffin. She knows that what we can't see in seeing her son is his childhood in that moment. That one of the things he's dispossessed of is not only of his life, but of the appearance of childhood. And so what does it mean to see this child who is worthy of being understood as a child and yet appears as a fleshy body that has been dispossessed of the appearance of childhood? I kind of explore how Mamie Till Mobley was aware of that and kind of thinks of the flesh as this connective, condition that ties us together despite the differences of our age and of our gender. And so in that way, it's a way of thinking of the impact of racialization as, of course, waging different outcomes, but nonetheless connecting us in ways that deserve our participation in terms of fashioning a response. And so, that's one example. Another example is Trayvon Martin, where his childhood wasn't seen, right, as someone who is walking down the street as a Black person, right? We know that George Zimmerman didn't see a person, number one, but he didn't see a child worthy of the customary protections of childhood. And so I kind of think about how that, not only the dispossession of childhood is operative there, but what it means to think about childhood as if it's conditioned through the meanings of culture, which is to say that it's not a natural status that we tend to think of it being as, which is, we all have a childhood, we all naturally grow into, adulthood in a way that's asocial. I wanted to think of age as a social product, as that which is the outcome and the production of economic and social and cultural ways of knowing the world. And thus it gives us a way of thinking about how the question of development isn't just a natural condition. It's one that is made through the violent racialized world. And so, we can understand how that has implications in terms of understanding the way we're all conditioned by that. Children have a status that is worthy of protection, but what if we thought of age as that which gives us an analytic for thinking about what protection looks for all of us? How do we think about the innocence of all of us? How do we think of the worthiness of all of us? And so Trayvon Martin's, life and death became an occasion to really kind of sit with that.
Yeah. Something that I thought of as you were talking is how your book and your reading of the Combahee River Collective really made sense of a teaching moment I had recently. So I'm teaching in our core sequence in gender and sexuality in world civilizations. And one of the texts that we grapple with is the Combahee River Collective statement. And this was just a few weeks ago, and I was really struck by and surprised by the fact that most of my students, Black and otherwise, really connected with these gestures to childhood and the sense that the members of the collective had that they were out of joint with this idealized image of childhood, but also of a future womanhood that they couldn't achieve. And I think putting it in the context of childhood and its dispossession in the case of Black children as a kind of basis for politics and action allows me to understand that moment, that classroom moment so much more. It also makes me want to jump around a little bit. I'm also thinking about your epilogue, which you call "And with Black Children." And as I read, I thought about the work of Salamisha and Scheherazade Tillet with A Long Walk Home and their ongoing programming, cultivating the leadership of Black girls, which, you know, you could say brings this kind of 1970s, 1980s Black feminist preoccupation with childhood into the present. And I just wanted to ask you what you think our kind of collective future looks like with Black children at the helm, or with Black children in leadership alongside Black adults.
I love that question. I think that the future entails, really sort of sitting with who we take seriously and who we don't, right? And I think that that's kind of, that's the feminist gesture, but it's also, I think, one that we tend not to think of when it comes to our relationship, right? As Black women, we're still adults, right? Our relationship to children, do we have a kind of dominant relationship in that sense? I really think of it as one where we really interrogate the nature of our hierarchies and the way in which they are operative in a way that, while it seems natural, is also doing a kind of political and ideological work. And so I would think that the way we might think of the childhood experience as being a site where real, important, and worthwhile discernments are made is a beginning, and perhaps a sort of gesture toward the future. It reminds me of, I was in a conversation the other week, and one of the participants in that conversation, Aria Holiday, mentioned that we don't often, even when as Black women were writing about children, the voices of children tend to be absent, right? That in a sense, while in Black girlhood studies, there's writing about children, sometimes the voices of children themselves are missing. And so I think that, kind of imagining what the experiences of childhood can do in terms of helping us think about our own, sort of pre-held norms, pre-held presumptions, and how they might challenge them. I kind of think also of girls who did this, right? Like, so Colvette Colvin, who in 1955, she was a member of the Youth Council of the NAACP and became, in Montgomery, Alabama, staged her own protest with regard to segregation on buses. And we know Rosa Parks for this action and for this intervention. And we understand Rosa Parks in a particular way, which is to say, not only in terms of this particular action, but in terms of a kind of class status that's associated with her work, right, with the NAACP, with regard to a particular, kind of version of femininity that's associated with a particular, skin shade, with a particular body type, with a particular agedness, right? She seemed appropriately aged in that particular moment. Whereas, Claudette Colvin is, at that time, someone who protested in a very different way, right? She was louder, right? She, as Monique as Monique Morris puts it in Push Out, where she discusses the political and social lives of Black children and Black girls in particular, she mentions that she protested with her body and that was seen as inappropriate. And so in a sense, I think that it might have been seen as inappropriate because it might have been seen as childish, right? That it might have been seen as immature. But we know that immaturity is a technology of domination when it's applied to those who are technically, by mode or by dint of law and societal norms as adult. We know that immaturity, when it's attributed to adults, is a technology of domination. So what happens if maturity becomes, or immaturity becomes, that which we use as a way of kind of framing, but also containing the action of children, right? Which is to say that it's not worth our serious engagement. I think that that's something that we need to work toward really thinking through, because the stakes of that have to do with what exactly we allow in terms of relationality. What exactly prevents us from being relational in ways that we can't yet imagine?
Mm-hmm. That is so insightful. There's a way that in thinking about childhood and, kind of with the body of work in Black girlhood studies and the kind of extensive literature on childhood and the development of childhood as a frame for thinking about life, that I realize how much people are taught to restrain their bodies as they get older, and how if thinking against that kind of discourse of maturity that you're critiquing for us, if that might allow us to loosen our bodies in a variety of ways, both for political action, for pleasure, and I'm just thinking about all of the different kinds of possibilities that opens up for us. So insightful. Before I ask my next question, I do want to remind everyone in the audience that we'll be progressing to a broader Q&A in a few minutes. So I want to invite you to think about your questions. You can drop them in the chat, or when we proceed to that part of the program, you can come off mute and ask your question. But in the meantime, I would love to kind of scale up, as your book does so beautifully, from kind of individual Black life to the geographic. And I've been thinking about oceanic lifespans in your book, and how in Black literary studies and Black studies more generally, we sometimes think of the ocean only as a space of death or as a space of memorialization, and at most or at best, sometimes a kind of mythic space of return. And so I would just love to hear you think more about, or tell us more about how you imbue the Atlantic Ocean with life.
Thank you. Yeah, I think of it in terms of a site where real violence occurred, right, as the site of the transatlantic, or the Middle Passage in the course of the transatlantic slave trade, but also a site where something was produced, right? So, of course, I'm drawing from Hortense Spiller's work in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, America's Grammar Book, which was an essay published in 1987, where Spillers thinks about the Atlantic Ocean as a site where a kind of social undoing occurred by virtue of the violence on slave ships. So thinking about that isn't necessarily a way to draw our attention or limit our concerns to the Atlantic Ocean as a kind of originary site of modern Blackness necessarily. I'm not thinking about producing an origin to modern Blackness in that sense. I'm interested in thinking about, and with Spillers, the undoing that occurs, right? The ungendering that happens, that once human beings taken from continental Africa are transformed from human beings into cargo by virtue of violence. The act of transforming a human being into cargo, into a thing, requires an undoing, requires violence. It requires, making people into something else. But out of that violence comes what Spillers refers to as the flesh, which is this kind of material embodied condition of possibility that not only registers the violence, but also becomes that which carries with it the potential of an alternative way of being in the social world. So if one is understood by virtue of being marked by enslavement, right? If skin becomes that which is the code for this history of violence, one can also imagine how that particular way of thinking about this historical undoing, which is in Spiller's particular essay, specifically generative in terms of thinking about gender, right? Thinking about the way that a two-part gender schema doesn't work in terms of Black subjective formation. I want us to think also about how age was unmade. So, not only was gender produced as something that we can't think of in normative binary terms, I argue that we can't think of age as something we think of in terms of discrete sequential lifespans or life stages, I should say, as a result of this undoing. And as a result, we're able to think of age as if we think of it as an analytical space, as I do, as that which gives us a whole other view of what Black subjectivity entails. And so I imagine that it gives us a view into thinking about not just the non-differentiation that comes with being in the oceanic, as Spillers explores, of course, kind of signifying on Freud, but also what that non-differentiation of subjective being means when we think of ourselves as being related to each other in non-hierarchical ways. So if we think of ourselves not only as eschewing the patriarchal logic of, hierarchy, how then does that extend to the way that we're able to think of our relations as perhaps horizontally oriented as opposed to vertical in terms of not just kinship, but also of inheritance, and also in terms of the varying modes of logic that come from a kind of patriarchal dominance that is passed down to relations, in kind of, in a hierarchical way. So, I mean, that's how the ocean at least begins to work. I'm interested in it as a historical site. I'm interested in it as a kind of site of analytical and theoretical production. And I'm interested in how it becomes a way for thinking not just of the violence of Western modernity as it applied to Blackness, but also as a condition of possibility for what Black life could mean and what it is.
Absolutely. And, it occurs to me that this is very much connected to your discussion of ghosts and of haunting. You show us so much how Black age, Black life, Black time is not linear, but perhaps segmented and layered or palimpsestic. And so I did want to ask a question about your reading of Equiano's slave narrative, which has really allowed me to see a familiar text in a new way. And as you write, we learn from the literary and cultural critic Lisa Lowe that the autobiography is a genre that indexes liberal progressive narratives or the triumph of freedom over slavery. And you disrupt this sense of progressive time by looking to ghosts and hauntings. So I'll quote from you. You write, imagine that Equiano, who makes the progressive transition from African child to slave to liberated man, is entangled with a ghostly counterpart. his sister. And as you continue, a silent, unnamed Equiano girl, a perennial female child. And so I would love to hear more about this ghost in Equiano's narrative, his sister, and the ghosts that kind of abound in Black literature.
Yeah, thank you. I think of the Equiano girl as being, a figure that we don't really, I mean, you're right. That text has been really read by everyone, right? And it was difficult to think of something new to say about it because it's one that we've taken up in varying ways for so long. But I was interested in how we focus on Equiano in the ways that you suggest and the way that Lisa Lowe makes brilliantly clear, right, that the autobiography is that genre of liberal personhood that gives us a kind of ideological grafting of the historical progressive narrative with the personal progressive narrative, right? So the development of the enslaved person who's a boy who becomes a liberated man and a man of industry nonetheless, right, becomes that progressive narrative that then gives the alibi to a kind of progressive history of liberalism. And so I wanted to think of what the alternatives that that text isn't exploring. So we know that Equiano, or at least in terms of the logic of that particular narrative, we know that Equiano isn't the only child in his family to be abducted into the slave trade, that he has a sister who's not named, and we know that their paths diverge in some way. While we know that Equiano eventually, travels the seas, crosses the Atlantic, we don't know whether the sister who goes unnamed, and thus who I name Equiano girl, stays on the continent of Africa, whether she's fictional, right? Because the sort of historical veracity of the text has been put into question, whether she also crosses the Atlantic. We don't know what her trajectory is. And so I, kind of discuss in the book how that lack of knowing what the trajectory of that figure is very much a part of how we don't know how to provide a history for a girl who is supposed to develop into something that, while we can see in a kind of conventional way how the enslaved boy can become a man, not just in terms of the liberated sense, but in terms of the gendered sense, in terms of the sense of age, we don't know what the girl should become. And I think that the ghost is the way that Equiano lives with that indeterminacy, even as he becomes what the narrative kind of propels him to be, right? He does become the liberal subject par excellence by the end of the narrative. He does become, a version of the most, successful, sort of subject who is liberated. But if we think about the inextricability of the Equianos, the man who we know with the history that we know, and the girl who he was separated from, whose history we don't know and can't account for and have no archival evidence of, then I kind of think of that haunting as that which haunts the history that we have. So if that haunting is part of how we have to live with the archival evidence that we have to live with the history that we've inherited, have to live with the terms that we have for thinking about liberated subjectivity, then it really does demand that we question the terms of those particular conditions. What does it mean to be liberated when you are haunted by that who is lost to history, that who may not have ever left bondage, but you don't know, right? And so the long and the short of it is that I think of the Equiano girl's gender and age, her girlhood in that sense, as being the condition for the indeterminacy that has to haunt us as we think about the history of the modern Western world.
Absolutely. And in that way, I think of that chapter and of your intervention more generally as such an important companion to Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. And so, as you said, there's much we can't know about this nexus of Black gender and age as it coalesces in the figure of the Equiana girl and of Black girls more generally, and yet that absent presence persists with us. And I think that is such an important kind of opportunity to pivot to a question that we have in the Q&A. And so I'll just again invite everyone to either come off mute or put your question in the chat so that we can extend this conversation. So our first question comes from C. Riley Snorton, who says, "Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I'm greatly looking forward to reading the book, Professor Ibrahim, and appreciate how this conversation gives us a way to think about age as another vector of Black dispossession, or perhaps to put it differently, as an animating counter illustration of the modern subject. Please share with us how you view Black age as mediating intramural difference. That is, do you feel that Black age takes on a different character or texture in relation to queerness, transness, or around citizenship, for example?"
Yes, thank you, Professor Snorton, for that question. I think it's important to, acknowledge that there are scholars who've written about age in terms of queer time, for instance, who give us a way of thinking about the embodiment of temporality through the kinds of modes of subjective difference and difference of social formation that Professor Snorton is pointing to. So Jack Halberstam is an important thinker in terms of thinking about queer time, which is a work that I draw from. I think Elizabeth Friedman's work is important in terms of queer time. I think that thinking about the ways that those in age studies have thought about sort of the ways that for white women, age has been, constituted as that which is untimely in its own right? Because in, the 19th century, as Corinne Field argues, white women weren't necessarily endowed with the status of adulthood. And it became, a kind of point of political, activism, right? So thinking about suffrage was really, in some ways, a moment to contest the terms of age, right? The idea that 21 should mean something, for instance, when it comes to white femininity or white womanhood, right? And so in that sense, I think that there's, many different areas of discourse that I was drawing from in my thinking that have thought about the ways that age is related to varying histories of contestation when it comes to dispossession. So, age thus becomes a way for thinking about how dispossession has worked in terms of gender in the context of whiteness. It becomes a way of thinking about how it works in terms of not having a future, right? In terms of the lack of thinking of the potential of something else to be in a queer valence, right? I think that there is a way of thinking about age as that which is attached to non-normative registers of time. And so in that sense, I think of Black age in this particular work as related to those particular other interventions. I think of Black age as being one, like a kind of analytical space that allows us to think about how the untimeliness of age at the particular intersection of Blackness has not only been a site of abuse and dispossession, but has also been a site of reclamation and invention, and in some ways a kind of sort of beginning point for a politics about what it means to be a subject differently in a social world, or what it means to challenge the very historical conditions of humanity. And so I think that Black age as a particular version of thinking about embodied untimeliness is a way of thinking about both the historical abuses, but also of how we've been constituted in the social world, but also of thinking about particular modes of reclamation. And that's the tension that I really wanted to track.
Thank you so much. I would love to continue the conversation with our attendees. We have another question. So from Nina Stritzler-Levine, who says, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I wonder about the portrayal of Breonna Taylor in the portrait by Amy Harold. Taylor is portrayed there in a kind of luminous youth, a woman seemingly suspended in time in beauty and freedom. And her posthumous portrait seems to afford her and arguably Black women in general an ageless beauty where she's neither child nor grown up. And so Nina would love to hear more about your thoughts on that portrait.
Yeah, I wish we could show it so that we could all have it as a reference as we consider it together. I think about that as potentially a moment that allows us to think about the ways that for Black women, womanhood is, while it may be endowed with maturity, that maturity is often a condition for punitive action, right? So when we think about the adultification of Black girls, we think of that not as a condition that endows children with adult privileges. We think about adultification as that which is the condition of possibility for intensified punitive action against children. And I think that as a result of this, we know that Black girls have been understood as mature. Black adults and Black women might be understood as immature. And like kind of Kaneesha, your extension in terms of the way that we can think of age as that which gives us a kind of way to think about which kinds of mobility or kinds of bodily movements are appropriate or not appropriate. I think that there is a blurring of the line between adulthood and childhood, adultification and infantilization, that has nothing to do with the social norms of protection or the social norms of privilege and obligation. And so to think about this image as that which does away with the kinds of social expectations of what the delineation between childhood and adulthood should be, speaks to that punitive blurring, but it also undoes it, so that it gives us a way of thinking about a space that in an attempt to reclaim age, right? I mean, if we think about the Black body as having been not just dispossessed of age, which is, I think, the case, right? Insofar as age is a social category with normative conditions for its knowability. But I think of it as, Black embodiment having been, emptied of age, right? So that it becomes a projection for any mode of meaning at all. You could project onto the Black body any kind of meaning, right? So Trayvon Martin becomes, a Black male who's criminalized, right? You can project criminality onto that body once you empty it of age, right? I think that in a sense, that kind of logic is precisely what's being critiqued, and also that which becomes the condition of a reclamation. If Black embodiment has been emptied of time, then let that time be one that connects us all. Let it be a time of not violence or the condition of violence or the condition of ongoing violence, but let it be the condition of eternal connection between us here and those who have moved on.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. It makes me wonder what other works of Black art and media do that work of blurring and undoing that we've been talking about here. We have another question from Marilyn Harper, who says, I love working with our youths. My name is Marilyn Harper. I'm a community activist with Southside Together Organizing for Power, or STOP. I love your opening statement about racism, mentioning Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin. Recently, there was a documentary this week about Emmett Till. My daughter watched it and asked me, Mom, do you remember when that happened? And I said, I was a little girl, but your grandmother lived in Mississippi at that time. She told me stories of what happened, and it was one of the most horrific stories. And her question is, how can we as a society encourage more Black youth to continue fighting for injustice, against injustice, and for equality for all?
That's a great question. I think, it reminds me of an earlier part of our conversation here and the work that the Tillett sisters are doing, and that a lot of women are doing, like, Monique Morris, for instance. I think that letting children know that their action matters is, I think, the first step, that their discernments matter, that they are in this world and they have a way of experiencing it, and they have a way of expressing that experience. And it's incumbent on us, right, as the adults in relation to children, to hear those discernments, to hear what they're saying, to hear what exactly is being communicated to us when they communicate, right? And so I think that that's, I think we need to be able to tell that to the young people in our lives, that their way of experiencing the world is legitimate and valid. And we need, right, all of us need to be able to communicate to each other about the way in which we are living in this world, because there's so much that connects our experiences. And so I think that that's maybe one way to, kind of begin, is how exactly do we think about the conditions of our relations, the way we're related in a condition of struggle, and then forge modes of communication through that. I mean, I think it in some ways it reminds me, again, to turn back to, the Combahee River Collective and that particular, that particular group, right? The Combahee River Collective as a particular, sort of group, but also to think about Black feminism beyond that particular, sort of group, but just in that milieu, right? Thinking about the way that, yes, racism impacts Black women and Black men differently, but gender can't be the divisive categorical tool that separates us, right? There needs to be a way to think about how we're related that holds, that holds at one time the way that gender is a particularly experienced mode of existing socially, but doesn't become that which separates us. And so I think that that's something we also need to work on doing when it comes to age. Thank you for that question.
It's a great question. We have another, and this may be our last question since our time together is sadly running out, but a question from Friedrich Statham, who says, "Thank you for this amazingness. I would love to hear something about how Black age feels simultaneous, compounded, almost oxymoronic at some points. What I'm wondering about here are the ways in which Black folks have been simultaneously uncle, boy, and auntie, girl in the white imaginary, a type of lack and excess at the same time. Is this something that can be thought through or understood through the Black age analytic?"
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of what Blackness is, right? Just to core overall, right? That it's excess insofar as, I mean, you know, if you think of Black embodiment as being constituted this way, it speaks to that which is excessive in some ways, right? That it could be excessively gendered or excessively sexualized, right? That's the sexuation of the body can be excessive. And it, at the same time, it could be deprived of gender, it could be deprived of sexuality, right? So in a sense, the body as fungible, if you will, or as Zaki Imam Jackson refers to it in terms of a plasticity, right? That if we think of Blackness as being constituted as that which is conditioned for the meanings of a social world that means to exploit Blackness, then I do think that there is a kind of, you know, a kind of malleableness that comes with that, right? If you're thinking about, you know, for instance, I can give you, I hope, a quick example of, you know, how we think of the categorical nature of Blackness within the domestic slave trade, right? You know, kind of referring to Walter Johnson's work in terms of the trade in Louisiana, you know, the antebellum trade in Louisiana during the domestic trade. There's a way in which, you know, age isn't registering a particular number of years lived, right? It's not registering a particular social life stage. It's referring to whatever perhaps a slave trader wanted it to be. So, you know, for instance, you could have the advertisement of an enslaved person in their prime, and you could make the body appear that way, right? So there's, you know, like you can sort of shave the face so that gray hairs don't appear. You could dye the hair, right? And then you could then market this body as if it's younger than it actually is, right? And in that sense, there's a kind of active making of the body into something else with regard to age, right? And so in that sense, the idea of age already being a site of malleability is part of the historical constitution of Blackness. But I think in terms of the cultural meanings of it, you know, I think that, you know, you're right. When we say girl, it's not as a way necessarily within Black culture, right? It's not a way of saying women are infantilizing each other, right? It's a term of endearment. It's not something that's meant to speak to this kind of abusive use of, you know, age or infantilization. But I think that, you know, when it comes to, you know, how the social meanings are kind of compounded, or the way that they blur, or the varying ways in which they become, you know, sort of generative in terms of their multiple meanings at once, the simultaneity of those meanings, you know, I think that in that sense, it's registering that malleability that comes with Blackness. And so I think that, you know, we can think of it in terms of the abuses of history. We can think of it in terms of the reclamations of history, you know, the way that it's been transformed into a site of reclamation. But I also think that there's a way in which, if you follow particular cultural histories, that you might find different outcomes according to them. So, I mean, this is going to seem outlandish, but, you know, one figure I didn't write about in the book because this is a fairly literary project, Michael Jackson stands out as a figure who did the most with age, right? I mean, in a sense, as a child performer, he was thought of as being, a kind of, I mean, he was thought of as being like another Jackie Wilson, right? Or another, like he was thought of as being really precocious. As an adult performer, he fashioned himself as a Black Peter Pan, which we don't have in literature, right? And so in a sense, it seems like the exploitation of the malleability of age was something that became a performative conceit, right? It became that which was possible as a result of performance. And so I think that there's a lot that still needs to be done. It wasn't within the purview of this book to explore entirely, but I think that the generativeness of age can be opened up in terms of particular cultural sites to see what sort of histories get unearthed with that kind of specific focus on varying modes of cultural production.
Thank you for that. It reminds me, once more how much your book has opened up for us in terms of Black time studies and the work that is kind of ahead of us as practitioners of Black literary studies and Black studies to kind of further clarify time and age. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaneesha. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Likewise.
And thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much, Habiba and Kaneesha, for such a wonderful event and a thoughtful conversation. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture for co-sponsoring this event and hosting us this evening. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you very soon at another event. You can see our full lineup of events at semcoop.com/event. And you can see CSRPCs on their website and purchase copies of Black Age so we can continue the conversation there. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.